The DLC of Resident Evil 4 Remake is not only overwhelmingly positive on Steam, but it's also considered one of the best DLCs in the franchise. But does that make it better than the original? Well, for starters, this remake is twice the length as that of the original. But not only that, it changed so many things that the original just never had. In the original, you start off in the village after a small brief of what Ada is up to without knowing anybody other than Wesker. In the remake, however, Ada starts off in the castle with Louise, and they are already working together to get what she wants. Starting with Louise is the best thing because he became a much more important character than he was in the original. And Ada has interacted with much more characters in this remake, including Vertigo, which I was very much surprised with. Not only that, we also get to know that Ada is somehow affected by it. This adds a new interesting factor that the original just never had. We get to face this Vertigo a number of times and it becomes one of the biggest enemies that Ada has to face on her own. This also solved the question of where the other Vertigo was, because as Leon, we only fought one. There were a few other interesting things, such as Ganados not reacting to you at all when they were heading to church after Ada rang the bell. How we got to know that Ada is also infected just like Leon. And the game also shows how badass she is because she pukes out the infection, unlike everybody else who actually had to get some kind of surgery done. There were many questions that this DLC actually answers, and there are some things that we didn't get to see as Leon, but we got to see as Ada, and they were much more interesting than the original. And in terms of enemies, in the original, Ada did fight El Gigante boss and Sadler boss, but in the remake, she fights even more. We got to deal with a new monster which I was completely surprised by. He reminded me a lot of Sturm from Resident Evil Village, and we got to see this badass scene with lasers where that new monster died. And we also get to fight the most terrifying enemy of this game, the Regenerators. The way you get to come across these enemies is quite interesting. There's an actual story that leads you to fight these enemies. While the original did have Ada fighting Krauser, it kind of didn't make sense how he transformed into that creature and then also transformed once again to fight Leon. So I'm glad that the remake did not give us this, but the fact that there was no interaction whatsoever between Ada and Krauser was different. All we got to see is that she knows who Krauser is. So now as us players, we want to see that interaction between Ada and Krauser in the later game. Speaking of the story, unlike the original, where it only showed where Ada was at the time when Leon was also in the village, the remake expands upon it in a much more meaningful way. Ada and Louis had an interesting relationship in this game. While Ada wants Louis to give her the amber, she also ends up saving Louis and helping him to get the ingredients so that he can make a cure to save her. Louis became such an important character, especially in this DLC. Not only that, we get to see Ada interact with Wesker in person, which adds so much more depth as to what he is doing. We also got a question answered as to who planted all the bombs on the island, and also in the end how it didn't exactly work as planned. Even for a brief moment, Ada meets Ashley. This DLC also showed how much Ada cared for Leon. The game even sets up what might happen in the next game by giving us hints on what Wesker is really planning. And on top of story, the gameplay also added new things such as the zip lines. While the original did have zip lines, the remake used it even more, using zip lines to do a roundhouse kick to enemies when they're standing next to a surface, or using the zip line to do kicks when they are stunned are such a cool addition. Instead of going to the enemy and then kicking them, you can just use the zip line, and that makes it so much more fun. And just like playing as Leon, it was quite fun playing as Ada and fighting all of these enemies. And to be honest, Ada gets to fight almost every single enemy that this place has to offer, while in the original, that was quite limited. The DLC for Resident Evil 4 Remake, which everybody was waiting for, actually is much better than the original. While the original will always have a special place in our hearts, the DLC was made in such a way that it was more fun and interesting and not just for the sake of it. And speaking of Resident Evil 4 Remake, I got to speak to Salazar's voice actor where he talks about how he got into this franchise in the first place. Check this video out to know more.